Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple, the Indy author. I write the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and suspense shorts and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, and I also write, speak, consult, and podcast on the writing craft and the publishing voyage. You can find out more about me and my work at mattydalrymple.com and at theindyauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask 2 questions related to an author's latest book. What did they learn from their book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And I'm here today with Frank Zafiro. Hey, Frank, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Frank Zafiro writes gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. A retired police officer who has written over 40 novels, his books feature police officers and criminals in various subgenres. And he was a guest on the Indy Author Podcast way back in episode 160, where we talked about mistakes writers make about police roles and how to avoid them. His latest book is Hope Dies Last. And so today I'm asking Frank the 2 What I Learned questions, starting with what did you learn from Hope Dies Last that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
That's a great question. And originally we were going to talk about a different book, but I felt so strongly about this one that I went back to this to talk about this topic specifically for what I could share with other authors. And it's a real simple, I guess, message that we all learned a long time ago, but it rings true. And that is that you can and sometimes should write about emotionally powerful experiences that you've had. And while that sounds like a no-duh statement, I think that sometimes as young writers, we embrace that a little too much, and our fiction is very autobiographical, and we struggle with some of the things that make good fiction because that's the way it happened, and I need to get this in because it's so close to us. And if we become more mature in our writing, as we go along, we may reach a point where we can re-engage in those powerful emotional experiences in a way that still allows us some detachment, that artistic and creative and craft centric detachment when it comes to the work itself. And so if all that blathering doesn't make sense, here's the specifics of it that hopefully will. So Hope Dies Last is the 4th book in the Stefan Kopriva mysteries. Kopriva is a former police officer who left the department in disgrace. His series picks up about 10 years after that event, and he's still haunted by those events. Not an uncommon scenario in our subgenre for sure. But after the first 3 books, and at the beginning of this book, he's reached a point at which he's actually in a fairly decent place. He's mentally more healthy than before. He's physically doing better, and he's in a positive relationship with a woman who is good for him. And then the mother that deserted him when he was a kid shows up again and wants something, and then trouble follows. And that's the bulk of the story. Well, why is this the topic that I'm talking about? Well, for Kopriva, it was a big deal that his mom left him when he was very young and kind of came in and out of his life. And eventually he hadn't seen her since, 10 or 11 years old. And the incredible amount of shattered trust that takes place in that sort of a scenario has a huge impact on someone emotionally. And obviously I know this because I wouldn't be talking about it in this way if it weren't also true in my own life. The details are different, the specifics, but the dynamic is very much the same. I understand how Kopriva feels because that's how I felt. But if I had written about this powerful a topic, I mean, if you think about it, it's your mother. I mean, the person who's supposed to love you more than anyone else in the world, abandoning you. What's the emotional fallout of that? It's pretty severe. If I'd been a younger writer and a younger person writing about that, I think it would have been a lot more sloppily presented and maybe not in a way that the reader could connect to quite as well. But because I didn't really write about it, and I'm going to be 55 next month, so I didn't really write about it. I've been writing since I was 10. So I didn't really write about it for 45 years, 44 years, whatever it is. Certainly not since the early 2000s when I became what I would call professional at this. Those couple of decades of learning the craft gave me, I think, that ability to go and stand outside of the story as well as be inside of it. Whereas a very young author, I would have been 99% inside of that story. Is any of this making sense?
It is. As you're talking, I'm just trying to reconcile in my own mind that idea that I think I see where you're going with this. And yet there's also that advice of you can't write about this stuff unless you're willing to tap into your deepest, darkest fears and all that kind of thing.
Right.
And
Right.
wondering what the characteristic is of you've gone overboard or you're not bringing sufficient creative control or craft control or editorial control or something like that to it.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, which is why I kind of wanted to touch on it with you here. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately for me, I have other angsty issues to work on in the writing process. So I was not at a loss for them throughout my writing career. And even something I'm not angsty about, I have a pretty good imagination and can imagine what it would be like. But this was one thing I kind of left alone. I mean, I alluded to it in the earlier Kopriva books and stuff, but I never really tackled it head on. And I got the sense, and maybe it's just me personally, but certainly it's worth sharing with other writers in case they're facing it, that I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I waited until I had the ability to present it in a way that still had some discipline, I guess, if anything else. I mean, maybe that's the way to describe it, where it wasn't just wrapped up completely in the emotional elements of it, but the craft, the person monitoring the craft was there and was part of the process as opposed to just I mean, I did some emotional writing when I was young, and I don't feel like it was my best writing. I feel like there was some great stuff there to work with, some great raw material, but it wasn't necessarily, it was great for me to write. It wasn't necessarily going to be as great for somebody to read. And so I'm not offering this as a hard and fast rule by any means. If you feel something passionately and want to write about it, you should. You should do whatever you want. You shouldn't listen to anyone. We're all full of crap. But I did want to share that for me, this was a good thing. It was a good thing that you could put it off. But more importantly, it's like maybe I wasn't ready to write for it about it. And now that time has passed where I didn't necessarily feel it like I needed to, but you still can. And you can tap into it. And there's a benefit now to being a more disciplined, more experienced, more objective individual and writer. So it's just one more option for writers out there. And that I thought I'd share that you can still go back to something that you wished you had written about when you were 20 and didn't. And the time hasn't passed. You can still tap into it because believe me, I did tap into the emotional piece of it. It was a difficult book, even at this age, but it was made less difficult by the fact that I could also detach myself and be that more clinical, disciplined, professional writer dealing with the story, not just trying to chronicle how I felt, which I think sometimes when you're too close to an event or a feeling, that's more what occurs.
Yeah, I think that it's clear that time was on your side in terms of giving you the distance that you needed to bring that more editorial perspective rather than the creator perspective. And I'm wondering if you would have advice for writers who are writing about something that's still very close to them and feels very raw to them, and they don't want to put off sharing that.
Right.
And we've been talking in terms of this difference between wearing your writing hat and wearing your editorial hat.
Mhm.
Do you have any tips for a mindset people could bring if they want to get that story out into the world sooner, but they do still need to like impose some distance on the story without having that benefit of time?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same advice I had to follow, even though I was more distant from it. And it kind of falls in line with the age old advice of being willing to kill your darlings. And it's kind of a cousin of that, I guess. When I gave this to one of my very first, my editorial reader, he came back and basically said that Kopriva was being a little bit of a baby. And, it's been what, 30 years? And he was pretty harsh about that. And at least that's how it felt initially when I got the information. And I was a little defensive. I mean, I didn't respond defensively, but sitting there, I felt a little defensive about it because Kopriva's emotions were by and large my emotions. I mean, they were close. They were very close. And what I realized is I needed to listen to him because I'm trying to present a story that people will find insightful and entertaining. It's not a therapy session necessarily, right? And so if Kopriva was coming off as too weepy, as too maudlin, as too much of a baby, to quote him, I needed to look at that. But I also needed to balance it with the fact that he's a friend of mine. So I know he grew up with a mother and a father, and his mother's still alive. And while he complains about my mom, blah, 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 it was like, you get to complain about your mom because she's part of your life.
Yeah.
And there's no way that anybody who hasn't had this event occur can truly understand how it feels. It's one of those kinds of things. There are many in this world where you just really can't understand unless you've been through it, at least not completely. And so I had to kind of find the middle ground between the two. Like, you don't entirely understand how big a deal this is to this person, especially when she comes back into his life and betrays him again. Spoiler alert. But at the same time, he's having a reader reaction, and other readers are going to have that same reaction. So perhaps I need to dial that back and still make sure that the intensity of the emotion is expressed with maybe being done in a way that doesn't make people think he's overreacting or being a baby. So the advice would be to listen to your gut and to your beta readers and find the balance between them so that you don't lose the essence of what you're trying to portray, but you still make it poundable and enjoyable for your intended audience. Otherwise, it's a journey and don't worry about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that might be a good, well, you can let me know if this is a good segue into the aspect of what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow readers. And the question I'm thinking of is that more experienced authors often give less experienced authors the advice that if you read a review or you read beta reader input, a critique group input, whatever it might be, consider that they're reacting to the work. They're not reacting to you personally.
Mhm.
But if your buddy's saying that Kopriva's acting like a baby and it's feeling like you, that's difficult to separate yourself from the input you're getting about your character and feeling it personally. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, that's where I think the experience comes in, Maddie, because you, when you first start writing, the slightest little criticism, however gentle, feels like a dagger to the heart. And you just have to, you have to toughen up as well as I do. So when you just have to separate the two, I guess you just have to be willing to take those criticisms and go, you know what? That's where they're coming from. It's the same with all beta readers. I disregard advice from beta readers. We all do, right? Especially when they're one-offs. If I have 12 people reading it and one person snags on something and no one else does, and I think it's good, I disregard what that person says. But if 3 people snag on it, we'll start to look at it a little bit. And so, yeah, I think it helps. Boy, what a good opportunity to build up a little bit of calluses when it's a character and a reaction that is closely modeled on your own experience. I think it's a crash course in building up some of those calluses.
What kind of interactions have you gotten from readers outside your close readers, your beta readers,
Mhm.
your friend that gave you input? Once Hope Dies Last was kind of out in the wild, was the reaction you were getting from readers in line with what you were hoping or what you had expected?
It really was. I didn't get any, what a baby this guy is,
Only
one-star
your
reviews
friends
or
said
anything
that.
like that. Well, and we fortunately have a relationship where we can speak in shorthand. We don't have to couch things because we both know whose side the other person is on and what the intent is. But no, yeah, there's been the responses have been in line with what I had hoped. And I have to credit that interaction early on with that because I did temper some of his emotional reactions and modify them a little bit to address that. And so how am I to know that isn't why the readers aren't saying this is a little overwrought? Because it is a powerfully emotional book. There are a lot of emotions in there and people are responding to them, but you could overdo that. And I haven't gotten any responses as of yet that was overdone. So I feel
That's
pretty good about where it ended up.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that because I don't know that I've ever heard an example where the content of the book was as personal. I'm sure they're all out there, but I just haven't had a chance to talk with someone. I appreciate you being able to share that perspective. And if people are now intrigued to find out the story behind Hope Dies Last, Frank, please let them know where they can go to find out about you and your work online.
The easiest way is my website, frankzafiro.com. Zafiro is Zafiro. And of course, I'm on Amazon and BookBin, social media platforms, and so forth. I have a newsletter. So, pretty good number of ways to get in touch.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.